Okay, welcome everybody. My name is Ryan Scherba. I am the editor of Balkan Insider. It's the only DC-based newsletter focused on Southeastern Europe. Today we have a very, very, very special guest. He has a very long academic history and history in politics in Serbia and at the UN. So Mr. Vuk Jeremic, who he studied at Cambridge. He's got his master's from Harvard, PhD in quantitative finance from University of London. Within Serbian politics, he served as the special envoy for Euro-Atlantic affairs at the Ministry of Defense, former foreign minister for 5 years, from 2007 to 2012. He was also a senior foreign policy advisor to President Boris Tadic. After that, he became the 67th or the president of the 67th United Nations General Assembly. That was back in 2012. Following that, he started the Center for International Relations and Sustainable Development. He's run to be the Secretary General of the United Nations. Most recently in 2017, he was a presidential candidate in Serbia. And then in 2017, he founded the People's Party, which is a part of the Alliance for Serbia. It's an opposition party. And yeah, we're very happy to have you on. It's going to be a great conversation, and welcome.
Hello, thank you very much for this very kind introduction. It's a great pleasure to be with you all. And just a disclaimer at the beginning, I did study for a PhD in applied mathematics at the Imperial College London, but I never graduated. So unlike many ministers in the Serbian government who do have this title of PhD, but I'm not amongst them. So I'm just a humble commoner. I'm not a doctor of science. So just to get that out of the way. But it's a great pleasure to be with you and to talk to you about Serbia and the region in these most interesting times, regionally and globally.
Yeah, no, I mean, let's jump right in. Serbia just had parliamentary elections on June 26th. One of the first states in Europe to hold parliamentary elections during this COVID pandemic. The opposition, including the whole Alliance for Serbia, boycotted, while President Alexander Vucic's coalition, SNS led, they pretty much dominated, getting over 60% of the vote, an absolute majority. So what I want to know is what led to the decision to boycott these elections, and how would you grade the effectiveness of the boycott?
Well, it wasn't really an election. I'm not sure if the election is the right word. It's a misleading word, because when you say election in a democratic world, you mean, people going and making a choice who they want them to be, to represent them. But this wasn't really the case in Serbia. Well, for many, many months and actually years leading to the election, we had the establishment of a total control of the government over all mainstream media. So it wasn't really possible to go out and present your views and your policies to the electorate. It's something very close to Turkey that we have in that sense. So no free media, perhaps even worse. And it was before the COVID crisis that the opposition decided that there are no conditions for a free and fair election in Serbia. And we decided it was pre-COVID crisis that we're not gonna participate in the elections originally scheduled for April 26. And then COVID came, and the whole world, started tumbling upside down. And then the government, sometimes in May, abruptly decided that the COVID crisis was over, and that they were going to hold the elections on June 21. So nothing changed in the meantime in terms of the conditions for free and fair election. Only this time it was exacerbated by the fact that the COVID crisis wasn't really over. But the government did declare victory over the virus. They removed all the precautionary measures to fight the pandemic. And we were trying to dissuade them, to make public appeals that there are no health conditions. There are no conditions for these elections to be held, that it would be actually a health hazard for the people to go out to the polls in millions and vote. As a result of the pandemic, there were actually no observers whatsoever coming from abroad. There was a very, very limited mission of the OSCE of literally 10 people who were instructed not to go to the polling stations, who did have a few meetings with us, opposition representatives. They also met the government representatives prior to the vote on June 21. But just to give you a picture of the real conditions in Serbia at that time, those OSCE people were instructed not to have meetings inside any building. They only could hold meetings with us in gardens and in the hotel gardens in the outside space, because they were told not to expose themselves to risk by visiting any of the polling stations. So we didn't participate in the elections. And the elections brought about a ridiculous result. You mentioned 60% that the ruling party officially got. But as a matter of fact, there were a lot of phantom parties that the government created right before the election in order to try and present it to the outside world that it was a democratic election with lots of opposition parties. Most of these parties were actually just literally made months before the election. And even that didn't work out too well for them. They brought down the threshold for entering the parliament. Only 3%, those parties couldn't make even those 3% with all the support, with all the logistical support that they have been receiving by the government. So now we have a parliament of 250 MPs, and 235 out of 250 are the ruling coalition. And I think on that count, Serbia is surpassed in infamy, if you will, in Europe only by Belarus. So we're in a pretty bad shape in that sense. This parliament is entirely illegitimate. They, by the way, didn't even finish the electoral procedures. The Electoral Commission is still processing. There were lots of irregularities that were reported by the domestic NGOs who were observers to these elections. So we don't even have the final results of the elections. But never mind, 235 out of 250 MPs in the parliament are basically supporting the government and the presidency of Alexander Vučić. Serbia is no longer a democracy. It can't even officially be called a democracy anymore. I just want to remind you that earlier this year, Freedom House, a very respectful, a very influential international organization based in DC that does its monitoring of the state of freedom and democracy around the world. It's been doing it for decades. It classified Serbia as hybrid regime. At the beginning of the year, we were dropped in that list from a democracy, from a free state to a partly free state. And later on in the year, I think it was a couple of months ago, Freedom House classified Serbia as hybrid regime. So greetings from the hybrid regime, and what a hybrid regime means, one could very plastically observe and see last week when we had massive demonstrations in Belgrade and exceptional brutality by the police and other elements of the Serbian deep state. So,
Yeah, so I want to touch on that a
this
bit.
situation.
So you have these protests. Some days have been extremely violent. Other days, there were sit-ins essentially on the streets of Belgrade to show that these are not supposed to be violent protests. These are showing the will of the people. So when you get those two elements, how would you describe like the atmosphere there? And do you think like the will of the people is truly reflected in these protests?
I think that at the beginning, the protests were like totally spontaneous, and the protests were triggered by one of the many uh, outstanding performances, outstanding in a very negative way, performances of the president who held a big press conference. He mixes up the concepts of a press conference and the address to the nation about 3 to 4 times a week. It really reminds one of how Hugo Chavez was talking to the nation when he was president of Venezuela. So 3 to 4 times our president has this mix of press conference and address to the nation that lasts for 1 hour to 2 hours. And he basically said, we are going to reintroduce severe lockdowns.
Mm-hmm.
And a lockdown in Serbia, from experience of March, April, and May, it means that you actually get to be shut in the house on Friday, 6 p.m., and you're only allowed to come out on Monday, and basically you have a martial law during those hours, so there's no way you can go out and show your face out. And that was after the elections, which were held in defiance of all the appeals and protestations that were made by not just the opposition, but a lot of very reasonable people saying, please don't hold these elections. These elections are health hazard. There are going to be severe consequences if you do go ahead and go for these elections. So exactly 2 weeks after this was held, our epidemiological situation in Serbia started becoming really out of control, and it's actually much worse now than what we did have in March and April. And then the president goes out and says, like, okay, I'm now gonna lock you down again. So that triggered the protestations. People came out in the streets of Belgrade in massive numbers, and that was peaceful. But then the government has this one trick, this one very well rehearsed exercise they do every time there is a protest against the government. They send a group of organized thugs, basically hooligans. They are in full control of the Serbian deep state. So every time you have a group of people who want to protest against the government, who want to protest peacefully against the government, you then send a group of hooligans who pretend to be part of the crowd, but then they start doing outrageous things like provoking the police, throwing rocks at the police, breaking things up, and then the police reacts in a very brutal way. But the police don't just react against these guys who actually started it, but they react against everybody. And then you have extreme brutality in the street. This is seen then on television. This is spread around the country through social networks. And then decent people, silent democratic majority, if you will, decide to stay home. So that's the trick that the government plays again and again. They send in the hooligans, they start messing things up, and then people just say like, hey, it's not worth it. I don't want to have my head broken. I'm going to go home. So, but this time round, it was more brutal than usual. This time around, they didn't hide their affiliations with the police. There are several footages around the internet that shows how they coordinated with the police, how they whispered with the police, and then right after coordination with the police, you had all these worst possible scenes. It's very unfortunate, but it's a part of the it's part of the manual of this hybrid regime that is being applied every so often.
Yeah, sure. And like speaking about these protests, right? There's always the accusations that there are foreign elements involved. President Vučić came out and said that he didn't name any specific countries, but he said that there were foreign security services involved. If you looked at some of the tabloids, informers blaming Montenegrins from coming over there. Courier is saying that it's pro-Russians, and then you have somebody like Vidovdan who are saying that it's actually Blackwater in the U.S. Which
this is like a very. It's also part of the matter. When there's trouble, be it in the streets or political or diplomatic trouble, Vučić has this storyline. Oh my God, this is organized by a foreign element. And then what he usually says to the people here in Serbia is that this is the foreign intelligence services of our neighbors' countries. And as you might imagine, the leadership of Montenegro and the leadership of Albania and Kosovo are not the most popular people here in Serbia. So when he insinuates that behind the trouble, there is like, I don't know, like a Croatian or Albanian or Montenegrin secret service, it creates a very negative reaction with the people. Then he calls his friends in the West and he says, oh my God, this is done by the Russians. Why don't you support and help me? I don't want to become a Russian colony, and look what the Russians are doing to me here in the streets. And then he calls Putin and says like, my God, this is another colored revolution. They want to do Maidan to me. Mr. President, who organized Maidan. The very same people who organized Maidan against you are organizing now things against me. So he says different things to different people. And because of the full control that he has over the media, this story is continuously bought.
It's almost like when Hoi Yi said, you can't sit on two chairs at once. It appears
well, he's been doing it for a while, and I'm sure you can't sit in two chairs indefinitely. And I very much hope that his time is that the time is over for this exercise. But let's hope it's sooner rather than later. But that's exactly what he's doing, saying to the Russians, the West is trying to unseat me, saying to the West, the Russians are doing it, and saying to the people of Serbia, those nasty Albanians and those nasty Croats and those nasty Montenegrins, they want to create mess.
Yeah, and so I kind of want to switch this over a bit now to, what's going on in the region more, right? We're back to the Kosovo-Serbia dialogue. After over a year and a half, there hasn't been any conversations. The timing of Thaci's, the release of the indictment that he could be charged with war crimes, even though we're waiting that from the pre-trial judge. And Lavrov in Serbia on June 18th, just before the elections. What do you see is coming out of this round, right? When you have the elements of the EU and the US that have kind of been in this bit of a struggle to host the dialogue?
Well, what's been going on for about 8 years now? It's been like 8 years, almost full 8 years. It's going to be in a few days, full 8 years, that Vučić came to power. He came to power with a promise that was made to left and right in the international community, that he was going to be the one to do the big historical thing that the previous democratic pro-Western government wouldn't do. And this was to recognize basically the unilaterally declared independence of Kosovo from the year 2008. And ever since, he has been engaged in negotiations with the Pristina side. And these conversations led to, I'm not going to say it led to nothing. They did come to certain agreements, some of which ended up being applied. But essentially, it's been dragging on for many, many years. And whilst he's been strengthening his autocracy in Serbia, he had the Western capitals, first and foremost, turning their heads the other way at the undoing of the democratic institutional order in Serbia. He's been essentially saying to them, like, look, I'm the one who's going to resolve this for you. I'm going to have to have very, very strong control over the media in order to sell it to the Serbian people. I will have to have a firm grip on power in order to do this historical thing. So this is really detailed. We're going to go back to normal once this is over. So don't give me too hard a time when I start controlling all the media, when I start intimidating the opposition, and so on and so forth. But at some point, he realized that the major Western capitals are no longer working together when it comes to
the toughest part of
Belgrade. Sorry?
That's the toughest part of this now.
Can you hear me?
Yeah, I can hear you.
Yeah.
When you have
He realized that in particular, Washington, that Washington and the European capitals are no longer working in sync when it comes to this. So he decided to exploit these divisions and basically to work on two different fronts. One with the Trump people, Rick Grenell, first and foremost, who became a special envoy of President Trump for this Belgrade-Pristina dialogue, and then on the other hand, with the Europeans, who have not really been concentrated themselves on this for a while because of so many difficulties that Europe has been going through and is still going through with Brexit and now COVID and whatnot. So I don't think that this latest round of dialogue, which was held online and to be followed up on Thursday, if I'm not mistaken, in vivo in Brussels, I don't expect that this is going to amount to much, because I think that Vučić counts on the divisions between the Western capitals, in which you can't really deliver a solution unless it has a full backing of all the major capitals. If for no other reason than for the reason of something having to pass through the Security Council, in which you have Washington and Paris and London and others, of course. So I don't think that, don't hold your breath. That's my opinion.
It seems like we've been holding our breaths for a long time for some agreement to come out of this.
No, come on, it's not a long time. I mean, look at Cyprus. Cyprus, that is a long time. And I think that this is exactly the model that Vučić wants. He wants this to be stretched indefinitely. He wants this to be always hanging in the balance. And for this to look like a low-hanging fruit that can be done. And there's only one person who can do it, the person who holds our levers of power in Belgrade. So keep working with me. That's his logic. and he doesn't want to finish it at all, ever.
And that's interesting because, Serbia's goal is to join the European Union. And it could be argued that, Serbia won't be able to join the EU without a comprehensive deal. So if he keeps holding on to this and just letting
Who wants
it,
to join? Tell me once again, who wants to join the European Union?
Serbia.
And who is Serbia? If Serbia is Alexander Vučić, then I beg to disagree with you. Alexander Vučić doesn't want Serbia to join the European Union because in order to join the European Union, you must reach certain criteria of a functioning democratic state. Now, Serbia is a hybrid regime. You don't have hybrid regimes joining the European Union. Once you're inside the European Union, you might have political domestic developments that lead to a situation, unfortunate situation, in my opinion, like in Hungary, or a little less unfortunate like in Poland. But when you are in an accession process, you can't join the European Union if you have a full dictatorship, if you have essentially a one-party rule. I'll give you an interesting statistics. Do you know which is the largest European party when it comes to membership?
The largest European party?
It's the Serbian Progressive Party. Yes, the largest party in Europe is Alexander Vučić's Serbian Progressive Party. It has 700,000 members. Just to give you a comparison, the CDU, the Christian Democratic Union in Germany, has 400,000 members. It's an insane situation in Serbia. We are a one-party state, and one-party states, they don't easily join the European Union. They don't easily fulfill the Copenhagen criteria for accession. That's why I said, no, Mr. Vučić doesn't want to join the European Union. He is in full control. He has everything. He's insanely rich and in full power, and he doesn't want this to change. It doesn't get better.
So it's just all rhetoric at the end of the day.
Yeah, of course. And you know what? The problem is that because of the European problems right now, they don't want new members at this moment either. So, so it's kind of a very, it's like a perfect negative storm for us. Vučić doesn't want us to join. Europeans, they can't really muster now a new round of enlargement anyway. So they're okay if somebody goes out and says, just like pays lip service, saying, yes, I want to join the European Union, and then goes back home to Belgrade and does something completely opposite. But since the enlargement right now is not really on the table anyway, then everybody kind of ends up being okay with it. And the only people who are becoming really, really frustrated with what is happening are the people of Serbia, the majority of which want to join the European Union, unlike Mr. Alexander Vučić.
Interesting. It's definitely a long process at the end of the day. I don't think it'll happen by 2025, which was the year that was talked about for the past few years. But now switching over to Montenegro. Montenegro has been protesting during COVID as well, the law on religious freedom, which I saw a video that you were actually at. And so I just wanted to get your thoughts on what's going on in Montenegro. At one point they actually beat COVID and it seemed like protesting would be fine. And then cases rose up again.
Well, Montenegro is what Mr. Vučić wants to achieve in Serbia, because we have a single party rule in Montenegro basically for the past 3 decades. So the longest serving European ruler is actually not Mr. Lukashenko. It's a mistake to say Lukashenko is the longest serving European dictator. It's actually Mr. Đukanović, who's been in power since 1987 uninterruptedly. His party has been in power even before, since 1945. But that's another matter. What really drew attention of the world before the COVID crisis struck the world and everything became irrelevant. Everything else became irrelevant.
Mhm.
Was a very, very controversial law related to the freedom of religion. Essentially, a law that would allow for the Montenegrin government to take ownership of all the churches and monasteries and property of the Serbian Orthodox Church. And it's a legislation that has no parallel in Europe. It's a legislation that was strongly protested, not just by the largest confession in Montenegro, the Serbian Orthodox Church, but also by the Roman Catholic Church and Montenegro's Islamic community. And Mr. Djukanovic just decided to draw a red line there to make this the point of greatest contention, because sowing division and sowing acrimonious division, it's the way for him to perpetuate his rule. When Mr. Djukanovic makes the choice about whether someone is for independent Montenegro that is part of the Euro-Atlantic community versus a part of Montenegro that has a very strong Serbian identity, and by extension means special relation with Russia, and it's all mixed up in Orthodoxy and so on and so forth, then the division in Montenegro is about 55 to 45, and Djukanovic wins. So every time you have an election coming up, like in Montenegro, which is going to be held in a month from now, then Mr. Djukanovic, about a year before this election, exacerbates division in Montenegro based on a national identity, Serbian versus Montenegrin identity, because that's a very well-known recipe for him to win an election. This time round, he, unfortunately for him, I think, went one step further and really poked into something very, very dear to so many people, even those who do not have a strong link to a Serbian identity. A lot of Montenegrins are actually the faithful of the Serbian Orthodox Church. And he did it in a very, very, very brazen way. So I know that Djukanovic tried to portray this as another Serbian and Russian conspiracy, but it has absolutely nothing to do with it. Serbian government is not really interested in anything apart from continuing to strengthen its own grip on power and being engaged in a whole range of corrupt activities. So what is happening in Montenegro is very sad. It's very disturbing. I think it concerns everyone who holds the freedom of religion close to his heart, Christian, Muslim, any religion. And it's all about continuation of power, so that after 30 years in power, Mr. Djukanovic can hold on to power for 4 more years.
Interesting. And I think we got time for a question or two. Ed Joseph, you have your hand raised. I'm going to unmute you. Okay. And you'll be able to ask a question. Ed, are you there?
Yes, I'm right here. Great to be with you, Ryan and Minister Jeremic. Drago mi je da vas vidim opet. Nadam se da ste dobro. Nadam se da ste dobro. Okay, great. If I could, I want to just ask you to look back and how Serbia arrived at this point. And I think you can remember the elections of 2012 that brought Nikolic and Vučić to power. What happened over that period? What happened to transform Serbia, which in 2013 had signed this breakthrough normalization agreement with Kosovo, the Brussels Agreement, what happened over this period to take the country so far backwards? And what did we do wrong, Minister Jeremic? What did we in the US and the EU, what did we miss over this period that allowed all this to take place? Please.
Great question, Ed. Great question, and thank you for asking it. I'm going to make a comparison with what President Erdogan once said, famously said. He said, democracy is like a streetcar. You get on, it gets you to where you want, and then you get off. So something similar happened in Serbia. There was a democratic election in 2012, and we lost. Fair and square, we lost. I mean, we could spend like hours now talking as to why did we lose. We obviously didn't do well enough. So people voted, and people voted for Nikolic to become president. And what President Tadic, who I worked for at that time, what he did is what a president of a democratic country that loses the election should do. He just congratulated Mr. Nikolic and left office. And we did the same. We left office. I mean, I left office as a minister, and many others did. So, and then Mr. Nikolic, having won the presidential election, decided to retire. Essentially, decided to retire. He said, "Oh my God, I've had enough of it. I've been fighting all my life to get into power, and now I'm finally in power, and I'm going to enjoy. I'm going to go to the London Olympics. I'm going to do protocolar stuff." And he let Mr. Vučić around the country. He actually given over power to him fully. He was at the time deputy prime minister. So Mr. Vučić took this very seriously. He started establishing full control over all institutions in the country, including judicial institutions. He started building the cult of personality. He did sign that breakthrough agreement that you're referring to in 2013. And by signing this breakthrough or semi-breakthrough agreement, he won the sympathies in the West. So basically, because he did sign this breakthrough or semi-breakthrough agreement, he was given, in a way, a free ride on pretty much everything else, especially when it comes to freedom and democracy and institution building in a country that was until then objectively on the path to join the European Union. Perhaps a slow path, perhaps a path frustrated by disagreements over Kosovo, but definitely on that path. And Serbia essentially steered off that path. Domestically, whilst Mr. Vučić kept charming his Western interlocutors by presenting himself as a person who's going to do the De Gaulle and Algeria thing. And I don't think it's a very good comparison because this is not really the same situation. Algeria was not to France what Kosovo was and is to Serbia. But basically, he kept winning a free ride, winning a green light, if you will, to keep doing what he's been doing. And now we are here. It is difficult to envisage that the United States administration, in the current shape, and a few months before the election, is going to pay any attention to any of this, what we're currently discussing. Perhaps the next administration might have a deeper interest in what is really going on in Serbia, and not just use Serbia through the lens of whether or not there's going to be an agreement with Kosovo, because a dictatorship in Serbia is very, very dangerous for the long-term stability of the Balkans, even if this dictatorship signs some sort of an agreement with Pristina, which I doubt they will. But even if they do, a dictatorship in Serbia a dictatorship of this sort, a kleptocratic autocracy, a hybrid regime, that's not good news for the region, and certainly devastating when it comes to prospects of joining the European Union. So what was wrong in the past. What I hope for the future is that the capitals of the world that hold ideas of freedom and democracy close to their heart, that constitute part of their values, is that they're going to start paying more attention to what is going on in Serbia in a similar way to which they did in the late 90s, when Mr. Vučić was last time in power as information minister of Slobodan Milošević.
If you got time, I think there's definitely one person who would be.
One more question, because I got to run to the opposition coordination meeting. We gotta try and figure out what to do with all these people in the street.
Excellent, excellent. Okay, Ambassador Warlick, I just unmuted.
Another old friend, Madam Ambassador.
Ambassador Warlick, you're still muted.
Very good. I hope you can hear me now, and it's great to see you, Mr. Minister. Yes,
Very good to see you. Good to see you.
Conversations in Belgrade, so it's great to see you still active, and really thank you for taking the time today. And I know you have to run, but you've triggered one of the exact questions I wanted to ask, which is, what is the way forward for the pro-EU opposition in Serbia? You've outlined the challenges that you're facing today, and in the wake of a very recent election, really interested in hearing a little bit about your strategy, what your strategy is for the way forward. And should you have time for just one other quick question, I'd be really interested in your assessment of the way in which President Vučić is seeming to try to balance the relationships with Russia, China, the EU, and the West. Obviously, there's been lots of discussion about the importance of Serbia making the strategic choice for EU and European integration, but I'd be interested in your views on both of those topics. Thank you. Great to see you.
Well, thank you. Great questions. Great to see you. I apologize in advance for being short, but you're asking essential questions. The way forward, I think, after the parliament became delegitimized, and with a delegitimized parliament in which basically you have no opposition, you can have only a government of questionable legitimacy, unable to stitch the country back up and heal these divisions. I expect that we're going to have more and more of these protests and locomotions. And I think that the European Union is a crucial player there, because it is essentially not in the interest of the European Union to have a country totally off the track of European process of integration, no matter how slow. But Serbia is right now off the track. And with the new methodology of the European Union, which allows for basically steps back in the process of accession, I expect lots of steps back in the future. So the European Union can engage in the future much more vigorously than in the past. And in a similar way to which they engaged with Northern Macedonia's government and opposition a few years ago, when they essentially decided to play a role of a mediator, but a very serious mediator with a strong mandate, not just from the European Commission, but also from the key European capitals, to try and help us get out of this negative spiral that we've been on for the past few years and for the past few months in particular. So mediation effort aimed at restoring media freedom and basically holding a fully free and fair election in a country. So we are gonna write to the European Union with this idea, with this proposal in actually the coming days. We have already made lots of calls and discussions with some of our European partners. So we're going to formalize this request in the coming days, and I expect that not necessarily right away, but in a month, 2 months, 3 months, we will be able to seriously talk about this European re-engagement, not just in Serbia, in the Belgrade-Pristina dialogue, but also re-engagement with Serbia proper, so that it can be brought back to the European path. And it would be great if this could be supported by Washington in the future once the election is over in the United States. Because if Europe and America work against each other, then very little can be done objectively. Not much can be done in any of the Balkan portfolio. So, and the last thing, Mr. Vučić has only one thing with the Western partners. He doesn't want the West to start working against him. So he keeps them at bay. He keeps giving certain big contracts to certain big European companies. To Washington, he found a friend. In Washington, he found a friend. He promised to this friend that he was going to resolve Kosovo with him to Rick Grenell. So he made sure that nothing negative comes from Washington towards him. So that's fine. He pays lip service that he wants to join Europe while dismantling democracy, and a lot of people in Europe are okay with it because they're just interested in the lip service anyway, not interested in real enlargement given the European crisis. When it comes to Russia, he gives Russia what Russia wants, and that's mainly energy interests. The energy picture in this country is you have Russia as the most significant player, especially when it comes to gas. It's a very lucrative business in Serbia, and a lot of people are ending up being really, really well off as a result of this. Plus, it is in the strategic interest of Russia to have Vučić in Serbia, because for as long as Vučić is in Serbia, Serbia is not going to go down the path of any Western integration, because it can't. I mean, you don't, as I said earlier, you don't easily receive non-democracies into your fold, especially not in the European Union. China is a new player. China is a new thing in Serbia. We've had the historical East-West and Islam convulsions in the Balkans for many, many centuries. This is the first time that there is a fourth player in the Balkan equation, and this is China. China comes with endless amount of money for our size, from our perspective. What they're prepared to give here, to invest here, is infinite, and the government is not asking too many questions as to how you're going to pay this back, and are there really environmental regulations and so forth. No. And China is, of course, not terribly miffed by the fact that there is, police brutality from time to time in the streets of Belgrade. And if there is a real opposition or no real opposition in the Serbian parliament, that's not amongst China's priorities, if you will. So Vučić gives to everyone what they want. There's one thing that he asks in return, and this is not to work against him, so that he can continue with his rule. So far, he's been successful. I don't expect that it's going to last for all that long. And in the end, Europe, I think, is the key. Hopefully, thank you very much. I really got to run because I'm actually chairing the meeting of the opposition, and it can't start before I go there. So I got to dash off.
Thank you so much for joining us, and thank you to everybody for listening in.